He came to fix the sink. Said it was no big deal. And maybe it wasn't, until I opened my mouth and let out everything I'd been swallowing for 17 years. My name is Clara. I'm 46 years old, and I live in a house where things are quiet, tidy, and slightly out of focus. I've been married for 22 years to Mark, the kind of man who always does what's expected, exactly when it's expected. He loads the dishwasher correctly. He refills the bird feeder. He remembers our anniversary, but only because Google Calendar does. He is kind. That's what everyone says. You're lucky. He's kind. And I nod, because he is. He is also a man who hasn't truly looked at me in at least 8 years. The kind of man who says, "You okay?" when I sigh too loud, then turns back to the TV before I can answer. The kind of man who touches my shoulder when guests are around, but never in the dark. Not anymore. Our son, Evan, left for college 5 years ago. Now he lives in another state, texts on holidays, and signs off with "love you guys" like we're a unit he once belonged to. I spend most of my days making things work. Schedules, groceries, the thermostat. And when something breaks, I tell Mark. 3 weeks ago, the sink began to leak. A slow, apologetic drip, like it didn't want to inconvenience anyone. I pointed it out. Mark said, "I'll take care of it." But days passed. Then more. Every time I brought it up, he smiled like I was overreacting. Said it wasn't urgent. Said we could manage. And I did. I placed a bowl under it. Emptied it every morning. Wiped the cabinet floor. But something about that leak, that tiny rhythmic proof that something under the surface had come undone, started to unspool me. It wasn't the water. It was the silence. I scrolled through local handyman listings late one night, under the pretense of looking for new curtains. That's when I saw Noah's name. Noah Landry. He used to live 4 doors down. His mother and I once shared recipes. His laugh was the background music to the years when Evan was still home, backyard barbecues, bike races, video game arguments. He'd carried my groceries when he was 14, barefoot on a summer afternoon. I hadn't seen him in years, but the listing said, "General repairs. Affordable. Local. Reliable." And I dialed. His voice was lower than I remembered. Calm. "Clara," he asked when I said my name. "Wow. Been a long time." I asked if he could take a look at the sink. He said sure. Said he'd be by the next afternoon. I thanked him, hung up, and sat with the dial tone longer than I should have. The next day, I didn't dress up. But I didn't stay in pajamas either. I picked a soft blue sweater, brushed my hair, and told myself I was doing it because I hadn't worn anything with shape in weeks. At 2:07 p.m., the doorbell rang. I opened it, and there he was, taller than I remembered, broader. His face a little more angular, but still familiar in the eyes. He smiled. "Still got that same wallpaper?" I laughed, too quickly. Guess some things never change. He stepped inside, wiping his boots on the mat without being asked. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and something older, memory maybe. He carried a small bag of tools, unzipped it calmly, crouched beneath the sink. "It's probably the gasket," he murmured. "These older fixtures wear down slow. You don't notice until it's too late." I stood near the counter, pretending to check my phone, pretending not to notice the way his t-shirt lifted slightly when he leaned forward, the muscles in his arm, the way he moved like someone sure of his own strength. "Want water?" I asked. He shook his head. "I'm good. Shouldn't take long." And then, without knowing why, I said, "Take your time." It wasn't flirtation. I knew that. It was something stranger. Permission. The room felt too quiet. The sound of metal clicking, cloth dragging. I adjusted a spoon on the counter, just to move something. My hands wouldn't stay still. He worked patiently, every movement grounded, assured. He didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't make small talk, but the silence between us thickened. Not uncomfortable, just aware. When he looked up at one point to reach for a new tool, our eyes met. He didn't look away. Neither did I. And something passed between us. Not electricity, not heat, just recognition of what I didn't know. But it tightened in my chest. He tightened the last bolt, wiped his hands, reached for a rag from his bag. I said, "How much do I owe you?" He shook his head. "Call it a neighbor favor. You're not really a neighbor anymore." His eyes met mine. "Aren't I?" I didn't answer. And he didn't push. He zipped the bag slowly, stood, adjusted his sleeve. I said, "Thank you." He nodded. Then he said, "You look different." I blinked. "Different how?" He paused. Then, "You look like someone who's been quiet for too long." And just like that, I felt my throat close. Because he was right. And I hadn't even known it until he said it out loud. He worked quietly. Noah didn't fidget, didn't narrate what he was doing like Mark did when he occasionally fixed something around the house. There were no sighs of frustration, no commentary. Just the soft shuffle of metal against porcelain, the occasional creak of the cabinet, the hush of breath between motions. I stood nearby, pretending to check my phone, pretending not to notice how the muscles in his arm shifted as he reached under the sink. He wore a black t-shirt that clung to the line of his back every time he leaned forward. His jeans were worn but clean, knees faded from work, and his hands, those hands moved with a kind of patience I hadn't seen in a long time. I felt ridiculous for noticing, but I noticed anyway. He was half under the counter, knees spread slightly for balance. I could hear the slight strain in his breath as he turned a wrench, the clink of the pipe echoing in the cabinet. I took a sip of water just to give myself something to do. Held the glass longer than I needed to, condensation running down my fingers. "You okay?" he asked suddenly, not looking up. I blinked. "Yes. Just watching you work. That came out wrong. Too honest. Too bare." He didn't laugh. Didn't tease. Just nodded once. "I like fixing things. It's satisfying." "I wouldn't know," I said, quieter than I intended. "I mostly just wait." The silence that followed felt more loaded than anything else. He adjusted a piece of pipe, tightened a fitting, wiped his hands again. "You shouldn't have to," he said after a long pause. "Wait, I mean." I leaned back against the fridge. The coolness of it made me aware of my skin, of how warm the kitchen felt despite the open window. I crossed my arms, uncrossed them. My body didn't know where to belong in that moment. "I used to fix things," I said. "When Evan was little, I changed the batteries in every toy. I assembled furniture. I painted his room. I didn't even mind getting my hands dirty. But somewhere along the way, I stopped. Or maybe I just stopped being asked." He looked up this time. His gaze didn't wander. It held. "That's not nothing," he said. "It doesn't feel like much now. You were still doing it. Carrying things." The way he said it made something ache. Not because it was romantic, but because it was true. And truth, when spoken softly, cuts deeper than anything shouted. He went back to the sink. I watched the tendons in his forearm shift as he tested the pressure. The leak had stopped. I could hear the absence of it, the silence where the dripping used to be. I hadn't realized how loud it was until it was gone. "I think that's it," he said, leaning back on his heels. I walked over, knelt beside him. The floor was cool. He moved aside slightly but didn't stand. We were both crouched in that narrow space, the cabinet doors open like wings on either side of us. "Can I see?" I asked. He nodded, pointed, replaced the gasket, cleaned the seal. "You'll want to keep an eye on it for a few days, just in case." but it should hold. I leaned in closer. He didn't move. I could smell soap on his skin, something herbal, faint but clean. "Looks solid," I said, my voice low. When I turned to look at him, he was already looking at me. It wasn't a dramatic moment. Nothing cinematic. But it was charged, quietly, profoundly, like the space between a heartbeat and a breath. He stood first. I followed. The shift in height made the room feel different again. "I'll grab my things," he said. I nodded. My throat felt dry. He packed up slowly. I watched the way he folded his rack, placed each tool carefully back in its place. There was something reverent in it. Not to the work, to the act of finishing. "Do you want coffee?" I asked. I don't know why. He looked at me. Not surprised. "Sure." I moved to the machine. My hands shook a little. I hoped he couldn't see. I ground the beans, poured the water, waited. He stood near the door, not hovering, not intruding. Just present. I handed him the mug. Our fingers touched briefly. He didn't pull away. Neither did I. We sat at the small table in the breakfast nook. The one Mark and I used to use when Evan was small, back when we talked more. I watched Noah sip his coffee. He held the mug with both hands, his thumb running absent-mindedly along the rim. "This house used to be louder," he said after a moment. "Yes," I said. "It did. I remember you laughing." I blinked. "That long ago?" He smiled, but not unkindly. "You used to sing to the radio while cooking. Your window was always open. I'd ride by on my bike and hear Fleetwood Mac." I looked down at my hands. "I haven't turned on the radio in a long time. You should." We drank in silence after that. Not uncomfortable. Not pressing. Just enough. Then he said, "You said to take my time. Before." I looked up. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Why?" I didn't have an answer. Not one that made sense. Because I wanted the quiet to last. Because I didn't want to be alone again. Because you saw something I forgot I had. Instead, I said, because I wanted you to. And he didn't ask anything more. The morning he came back, I had already cleaned the kitchen twice. I scrubbed the backsplash until my knuckles ached. I reorganized the pantry, wiped out the silverware drawer, ran the dish towels through an extra rinse even though they didn't need it. The smell of lemon cleaner clung to my hands, sharp and artificial. I wasn't nervous. I was unraveling. Mark had left early again, a meeting, he said. Kissed the top of my head like someone checking a box. He wore his usual tie, cologne, smiled in that distracted way he always does when he's already thinking about something else. I watched him go. The driveway still had a smear of snow at its edges. February light stretched long shadows across the living room floor. When the door shut behind him, the house folded into stillness. Noah texted at 10:04, "Mind if I swing by? Want to make sure the seal's still dry." I didn't answer right away. I held my phone, stared at the message. My hands were damp from the sink. I dried them too fast, my shirt catching at my ribs. I typed, "Sure. Anytime." Then I stood in the hallway, still holding the phone, feeling something slide loose in my chest. He knocked just after 11. I opened the door, and there he was. Same work boots. Same calm. A wool beanie pushed back on his head, cheeks pink from the cold. I stepped aside. He entered. Neither of us said much. He crouched by the sink again, unpacked his tools. I moved automatically to the counter, fingers brushing the edge of a coffee mug I wasn't really using. He opened the cabinet, reached in. His shirt pulled slightly when he stretched, revealing a thin strip of skin at his lower back. I looked away, not because I was embarrassed, but because it felt like something I hadn't been allowed to see in years. "I think it's holding," he said, his voice low, muffled in the cabinet. "But I'll double-check." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I wanted to say something, anything. So I asked, "You ever think about leaving?" There was a pause. "Leaving what?" he asked. His voice was still inside the cabinet. "This town. The people. Everything." He leaned back, wiped his hands on a cloth. Sat there on the floor for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I did. After high school. Moved north. Tried city life. And I missed the quiet. Missed knowing the names of the trees." I smiled. "That's very specific." He looked up. His gaze didn't drift. "It matters," he said. I stayed quiet. And then, softly, almost like the words slipped out on their own, I said, "Do I look different?" He blinked once. Then again. "You look like you've been quiet for too long." The air thickened. My lungs forgot how to work. I wasn't expecting an answer like that. I wasn't expecting to feel so seen. I turned toward the sink. My fingers gripped the edge. Something inside me buzzed, low, electric, grief-shaped. Noah stood slowly. I didn't turn. Behind me, I heard the soft breath he let out. Like he was waiting for something too. "I've been waiting to talk," I said, finally. But I didn't know who to say it to. "What did you want to say?" I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because the list was too long. Everything. Start with one thing. I turned then. Looked at him. Looked at the steadiness in his stance, the quiet attention in his eyes. I said, "I feel like I'm disappearing." And he didn't say that's not true. He didn't reach for me. He didn't deny it. He just stood still and gave the feeling space to exist. The words kept coming. Not in a flood. In fragments. I told him about the weight of silence. About how Mark and I hadn't fought in years, not because we were happy, but because the distance between us had grown so wide, there wasn't anything left to fight for. I told him about how my son had grown up, and how I still checked his social media more than I called him. Not because I wanted to spy, but because it was the only way to feel near him without needing permission. I told him how my body no longer felt like mine. How I dressed for invisibility. How I used to hum while I cooked. How even that had stopped. How I missed the sound of my own voice. He listened. He never sat down. Never looked away. He didn't say, "You're strong or you'll get through this." He didn't comfort me with cliché. He just said, "I hear you." And something about that simple, complete, unraveled the last thread. When I finally stopped speaking, I felt a strange kind of clarity. The kind you get after crying, even though no tears had come. There was no shame. No collapse. Just quiet. He knelt, zipped his tool bag. Moved slowly, deliberately. When he stood, he looked at me one last time. "You didn't break the sink, Clara," he said. "You just stopped pretending it wasn't leaking." He walked to the door. Paused. Turned the handle. Didn't look back. And left. When the door clicked shut behind him, I stood for a long time in the kitchen. The sink didn't drip. But something inside me finally had. After Noah left, the silence wasn't the same. It didn't echo. It didn't accuse. It didn't weigh on me. It watched. It listened. Something inside me had cracked, and through that fracture, breath had begun to move again. Slow, uncertain, but present. I didn't cry. Not then. I didn't clean. I sat down at the kitchen table and folded my hands on the cool surface, as if waiting for someone to speak. But no one did. And that was the moment I realized it didn't matter. Because I had already started. The next morning, Mark asked if I wanted to go out for dinner Friday. He was reading the paper, sipping from a travel mug, standing like always just near the door. I looked up from my tea. He smiled, soft and automatic. "You've seemed a little down this week." I thought about how little he saw. About how easy it was to mistake silence for sadness. And sadness for a fixable thing. "I'm fine," I said. Because it was true. I wasn't broken. I was becoming. I started walking again, early, before sunrise. The neighborhood was still sleeping. The air was sharp, clean. The kind of air that clears out the shadows clinging to your ribs. I passed houses with lights still off, lawns littered with last fall's leaves. I saw my breath in the air and felt the ground through my shoes. No headphones, just the sound of my own steps. It took a week before I saw Noah again. I hadn't expected to. I thought that was it, the fix, the leaving, the shift. But then one morning, I turned the corner by the small park 3 blocks down, and he was there, sitting on a bench, paper coffee cup in hand, coat open. He saw me before I saw him. He stood, not suddenly, not with urgency, just with that same calm presence. We didn't speak right away. He walked beside me. We looped once around the park. And then I said, "It wasn't about you." He nodded. "I know." It wasn't even really about Mark. He waited. I kept walking. It was about me. About how long I've been holding my breath. "I know that feeling," he said. "I thought you did." We sat again on the same bench. I told him more. Not everything. Not all at once. But pieces, like breadcrumbs. I told him I used to sing in the shower. That I read books I don't tell people about. That I write letters I never send, even to my son. That I still sleep on the right side of the bed, even when Mark's out of town, because shifting would feel like admitting I've been waiting. He didn't respond. Just nodded. Let it land. And then he said, "You can start talking now." And I did. I told him about the way silence becomes habit. About how it feels to be thanked for a meal but not tasted. How it feels to be touched but never noticed. How you can live in a house where everything works, the plumbing, the locks, the light switches, and still feel like no one's home. "I don't need saving," I said. "I didn't think you did. I just needed someone to hear me fall apart without trying to sweep it up." His hand didn't reach for mine. His eyes didn't search for a signal. He just stayed, quiet and steady. And somehow that was everything. Weeks passed. We didn't meet every day. Sometimes I walked without seeing him. Sometimes I saw him at the market, across aisles. Sometimes I just thought of his voice and remembered I was allowed to feel things. Mark never asked where I was going. Sometimes he noticed I was quieter. Sometimes he didn't. He kissed my cheek goodnight more often. But he still didn't ask what I dreamed of. And I had started dreaming again. I began writing in a notebook. Not a journal. That felt too neat. More like witness statements. Little truths that had nowhere else to land. Today I looked at my face and didn't flinch. I watched a woman laugh too loud in the grocery store and I didn't hate her. I didn't fold the towels exactly the same way and the world didn't end. I said my own name out loud, just to remember how it sounded when it belonged to me. One night, Mark asked if I was happy. We were sitting in bed. The TV was on. Some nature documentary he wasn't watching. I turned to him. He was looking at me like someone who's begun to feel the temperature change, but doesn't know whether to grab a sweater or open a window. "I think I'm starting to be," I said. And for once, I didn't ask if that hurt him. Because it wasn't his wound. It was mine. And it was finally healing. I never saw Noah again after March. I don't know if he moved, or if he simply knew when to leave. But I think of him when I hear the creak of the cabinet door, when I twist the faucet closed, when I pass a man in a black t-shirt reaching for a wrench. Not with longing, with gratitude. He didn't fix me. He just witnessed me starting. And sometimes, that's all it takes. Now, the silence in my house is mine. Not punishment. Not weight. Just breath. Just space. And I fill it with music sometimes. With humming. With phone calls. With nothing at all. I fill it with me. I still love the sound of the faucet when it shuts tight. No drip. No leak. No pretense. Just stillness. And the woman who finally let herself speak.